Weimar Germany, November 1923. A loaf of bread costs 200 billion marks. Your life savings, if you held it in marks, buys nothing. The bank account that could have purchased a house in 1918 at St. Buy Bread in 1923. 5 years. That's how long it took for a stable currency to become worthless paper. But some people survived. Some people even thrived, not by predicting the collapse, by following principles that work in every collapse, regardless of the cause, the country, or the century. Argentina, 2001. The peso is frozen. Banks close. You can't access your deposits. The government confiscates dollar accounts and converts them to pesos at a rigged exchange rate. You lose 66% of your savings overnight. But some people survived. They followed the same principles people followed in Weimar and Rome in every collapse. America 2025. The national debt is 36 trillion. The currency has lost 98% of its purchasing power since 1913. The Federal Reserve created $5 trillion in 2 years. The system is following the exact same pattern that preceded every currency collapse in history. And when the collapse comes, whether in 5 years or 15 years, the same principles will determine who survives and who loses everything. Here's what most people miss. When the system breaks, every tactic you learned stops working. Buy low, sell high. Diversify your portfolio, dollar cost average into index funds. All of that assumes the machine keeps running, that banks stay open, contracts get enforced, and paper promises have value. But in a real collapse, those assumptions evaporate. The brilliant part, you don't need to time anything. You don't need to know if the crash happens in 2027 or 2035. You just need to follow patterns that worked in ancient Rome, Weimar Germany, revolutionary France, and every other debt implosion in recorded history. These aren't predictions, they're observations. And the people who positioned themselves around these principles didn't just survive. They rebuilt wealth while everyone else was wiped out. Let me show you the 5 principles that have protected wealth through every collapse since civilization began. Let's start with the most fundamental rule. When currency collapses, physical assets retain value because they're real. Paper assets, anything that's a promise or a claim on something else, go to zero because the claim becomes unenforceable. Weimar Germany, 1918 to 1923. If you held 100,000 marks in a bank account in 1918, you were wealthy. By November 1923, that same 100,000 marks couldn't buy a single loaf of bread. The currency had been inflated into oblivion. A loaf of bread that cost 160 marks at the end of 1922 cost 200 billion marks by late 1923. Paper wealth vaporized overnight. But here's what didn't change. Farmland. A farm in 1918 was still a farm in 1923. It grew the same crops. It fed the same number of people. The mark price went from thousands to trillions, but the farm itself, the actual asset, didn't change. Zimbabwe, 2000s. Hyperinflation hit 79.6 billion% per month in 2008. If you held savings in Zimbabwean dollars, they became worthless. But people who owned farmland, livestock, equipment, they preserved wealth. The land produced food regardless of what happened to the currency. Argentina, 2001, 2002. The government froze bank accounts, then forcibly converted dollar deposits to pesos at 1.4 to 1. The peso then collapsed to 4 to 1. Anyone holding paper claims lost 2/3 of their wealth overnight. But hard assets, still there. Same principle across 3 continents, 3 different causes, 3 different timelines. In America today, most wealth is held in paper. Stocks, bonds, retirement accounts, bank deposits. These are all claims. A stock is a claim on corporate earnings. A bond is a claim on repayment. A bank deposit is a claim on the bank's promise. In stable times, these claims work. But in collapse, the system stops honoring them. Courts are overwhelmed. Banks fail, governments default, markets freeze, paper claims become worthless. Hard assets remain. Real estate is still real estate. Gold is still gold. A productive farm still feeds people. The asset has intrinsic value independent of the financial system. When the collapse comes, paper burns. Hard assets survive. Here's the difference that determines survival. A productive asset generates income, food, or utility independent of what anyone else thinks. A speculative asset only has value if you can sell it to someone else for more money later. The Great Depression, 1929, 1933. The stock market collapsed 89%. If you owned stocks for speculation, betting they'd go up, you lost almost everything. But if you owned productive assets directly, a farm, rental property, a business, you still received the production. A farm produced food you could eat or sell. Rental property provided housing people desperately needed. The market price didn't matter because the asset itself generated value. Productive assets create value whether the stock market is at 381 or 41. Speculative assets only have value if you can sell them. And in a collapse, there are no buyers. Venezuela, 2010s. The stock market went up 100,000% in believers. Sounds incredible, right? Until you realize the believer lost 99.9% of its value. Stock prices rose, but in worthless currency. Meanwhile, people who owned productive assets, farms, bakeries, transportation, thrived relatively. A bakery produced bread. People desperately needed bread. The bakery created real value. Contrast that with Venezuelan government bonds. They only had value if the government honored them. The government defaulted. The bonds went to zero. In America, 2025, most assets are speculative. The S&P 500 is valuable because people believe it will go up. Bitcoin produces nothing. It's valuable because people believe others will pay more later. Most real estate is speculative, bought to flip or appreciate. Productive assets are different. A farm that grows food is productive. A rental property you own free and clear is productive. A business that produces goods people need is productive. When collapse comes, own things that produce value regardless of market sentiment. The farm feeds you. The rental houses people. The business generates cash flow. Speculation doesn't. In stable times, debt is leverage. You borrow to buy a house, it appreciates, you profit. But in collapse, all debt becomes catastrophic. Your income drops or disappears, but your debt doesn't. The bank still demands payment. If you can't pay, they take the asset. The Great Depression. Farmers had borrowed to expand during the 1920s. Land prices were rising. Borrowing made sense. Then 1929 hit. Crop prices collapsed. Farm income fell 50 to 70%. But the bank debt didn't decrease. Between 1930 and 1935, over 750,000 farms were foreclosed. Families who had owned land for generations lost everything because of debt. Now compare that to farmers who owned land free and clear. They struggled. Prices were terrible. But they survived. Without debt payments, they lived on whatever the farm produced. Debt-free farmers kept their land. Indebted farmers lost everything. Argentina, 2001. Middle-class families had mortgages denominated in dollars. When the peso collapsed, peso income fell 66%, but the mortgage stayed the same in dollars. People's income fell by 2/3, but their debt payment didn't change. They couldn't pay. Banks foreclosed. People lost homes they'd been paying on for 10, 15 years. Meanwhile, people who owned homes free and clear kept their homes. Same crisis, same income drop, but no debt meant no foreclosure. Greece, 2010s. Incomes fell 30, 40%. Pensions were cut 50%. But people with mortgages still owed the same amount. Default rates spiked. Debt destroyed them. In America today, Americans hold $17 trillion in household debt, $12 trillion in mortgages, $1.6 trillion in auto loans, $1.6 trillion in student loans, $1 trillion in credit cards. When the crisis comes, that debt will destroy millions of families. The counter-argument is that inflation helps debtors. If you owe $300,000 and inflation runs 20%, your debt decreases in real terms. This is true, if your income keeps up. But in real collapses, it doesn't. The only safe position is zero debt. Own assets free and clear. If you own a house with a mortgage, you don't own a house. You own a leveraged bet that house prices stay high and your income stays steady. If you own a house free and clear, you own a house. Period. No bank can take it. Debt is leverage in expansion. Debt is suicide in collapse. Every other form of wealth can be taken. Land can be seized, gold confiscated, money inflated, businesses nationalized. But skills stay with you. They're in your brain. They can't be taxed, confiscated, or inflated away. The Holocaust. Jewish families owned property, businesses, wealth, all confiscated by the Nazis. But the Jews who survived often survived because of skills. Doctors, engineers, craftsmen, tailors. People with skills could work. They could trade labor for food. They could rebuild in new countries. The wealthy merchant who owned property but had no skills starved. The skilled craftsman who owned nothing but knew how to build survived and rebuilt. Soviet Union, 1917-1922. The Bolsheviks seized all private property. Aristocrats who owned vast estates lost everything overnight. But engineers, doctors, skilled workers maintained value. The Soviet state needed them. Their skills gave them leverage even under communism. The aristocrat who owned 10,000 acres but couldn't farm starved. The blacksmith who owned nothing but could make tools survived. Vietnam, 1975. When Saigon fell, millions fled. They couldn't take property. They couldn't take businesses. The Vietnamese refugees who rebuilt most successfully in America were those with skills. Doctors, engineers, accountants, mechanics. They arrived with nothing but their skills. Within a generation, they built successful lives. In America 2025, the most wealth is in financial assets and real estate. These are not portable. If you need to leave, you can't take your house. You might not be able to take money if capital controls are implemented. Skills in your head are the only guaranteed portable wealth, but most Americans have no practical skills. Can you grow food, fix machines, build shelter, provide medical care? These are valuable skills in every economy, stable or collapsed. Develop skills that produce value independent of complex systems. Skills are the foundation of rebuildable wealth. Everything else can be taken. When systems collapse, institutions fail, banks close, governments lose authority, police can't enforce laws, the entire institutional framework breaks down. But local networks of trusted relationships survive. Soviet Union, 1991, 1998. The Soviet government dissolved. The currency became worthless. Pensions stopped. Supply chains broke. Grocery stores were empty. Russians survived through local networks. Families shared resources. Neighbors traded. Communities organized security and shared resources. The people who survived best weren't the wealthiest. They were people embedded in strong local networks. The isolated individual with money in the bank starved. The connected person with relationships thrived. Argentina, 2001. When banks closed, neighborhood assemblies formed. People organized locally to barter, share resources, provide security. These informal networks became more important than government. People embedded in these networks could trade skills for food, labor for goods. Lebanon, 2019 present. The pound lost 90% of its value. Banks closed. The government became dysfunctional. But Lebanon hasn't descended into chaos. Why? Because Lebanon is organized around family and religious community networks. These networks provide what the government doesn't. Before modern institutions, all economic activity happened through trust networks. You traded with people you knew. You borrowed from people who knew you'd repay. Modern institutions scale beyond local trust. But when they fail, we revert to trust networks. In America 2025, most people are institutionally embedded but locally isolated. You have a bank account but don't know your neighbors. You rely on Walmart for food but don't know local farmers. You rely on police but don't know your neighborhood. This is catastrophically fragile. When institutions fail, you have no fallback. Build local networks now. Know your neighbors. Develop reciprocal relationships. Embed yourself in a community. As institutional trust fails, local trust becomes survival infrastructure. The person with strong local networks will survive. The isolated individual will struggle. Notice what's not on this list. Which specific stocks to buy. Which cryptocurrency to hold. Whether gold or silver is better. Those are tactics. They might work, they might not. It depends on timing, on the specific collapse, on 1,000 variables. Principles work regardless. They worked in Rome when gold was money. They worked in Weimar when paper was money. They'll work in America whether the collapse is hyperinflation, deflation, or currency reset. And here's the genius. You don't need perfect timing. You don't need to know exactly when the collapse comes. You position according to principles that survive collapse, and you're protected regardless of timing. Own hard assets instead of paper. The collapse could come in 2030 or 2040. Doesn't matter. Hard assets preserve wealth in both stable times and crisis. Own productive assets. If the system stays stable, productive assets generate income. If it collapses, you have production. Eliminate debt. In stable times, you have resilience. In collapse, you survive while debtors lose everything. Develop skills. In stable times, skills increase income. In collapse, skills become your only portable wealth. Build local networks. In stable times, you have community. In collapse, you have survival infrastructure. These principles improve your life now and protect you later. The mistake most people make is waiting for certainty. They want to know exactly when the collapse comes. They want a date, a signal, a flashing red light. But collapses don't announce themselves. By the time it's obvious, it's too late. The genius of following principles is they don't require prediction. You position according to what survives collapse, and you're protected regardless of timing. These 5 principles are ancient. They've survived 3,000 years because they're true in every economic system. Roman Empire, medieval Europe, Industrial Revolution, modern America. The principles don't change because human nature doesn't change and mathematics don't change. When debt exceeds the ability to pay, collapse follows. When currency is debased, paper wealth evaporates. When institutions fail, local networks matter. These aren't predictions. They're patterns that have repeated hundreds of times. The American collapse will follow the same patterns. The tactics that work this time will be specific to our situation, but the principles remain. Hard assets survive. Productive assets generate value. Debt destroys. Skills are portable. Local networks outlast institutions. Position according to these principles now, and you survive what's coming. Ignore them and follow tactics, and you're gambling that you can time the collapse perfectly. That's a bet most people lose. If this showed you that principles matter more than tactics, that the same 5 principles have survived every collapse in history, and that you can position right now without needing to predict exact timing, subscribe. Because the next video will show you the specific tactics that align with these principles in 2025 America. Which hard assets make sense in a digital economy, which productive assets generate value in modern markets, how to eliminate debt strategically, which skills are most valuable, and how to build local networks in an isolated society. The principles tell you what to do. The tactics tell you how. These 5 principles worked in Rome, in Weimar, in Argentina, in every collapse. They'll work in America. The only question is whether you'll follow them before the window closes, or whether you'll wish you had after it's too late.